This is not a cartoon. This is a real Russian folktale told for generations. And if you like, share, and subscribe, you will get lucky. And to understand the true story of Masha and the bear, we must return to a time when stories were not written for entertainment but spoken aloud in villages surrounded by forests where daily life depended on awareness, caution, and memory. And in this setting, the story begins with a young village girl named Masha who lives with her family near the edge of the woods, and like many children, she is curious, energetic, and eager to explore. And one day she joins her friends to gather berries and mushrooms in the forest, promising the adults she will stay close and not wander far. Yet as the group moves deeper among the trees, Masha becomes distracted by ripe berries and hidden patches of mushrooms, and slowly, without noticing, she drifts away from the others until familiar voices fade, paths disappear, and the forest surrounds her on all sides. And this moment is important because in traditional storytelling, becoming lost marks the beginning of the lesson. And as daylight fades, Masha realizes she is alone and afraid and continues walking until she comes upon a small wooden house standing quietly among the trees and seeking shelter. She enters and discovers that the house belongs to a bear. And in the original folktale, the bear is not playful, friendly, or humorous, but large, powerful, and authoritative, a creature who controls his space. And when the bear finds Masha, he does not eat her or harm her, but he refuses to let her leave, keeping her in his home and making her cook, clean, and perform household tasks. And this situation is meant to show listeners that once a child enters danger, strength alone decides what happens next. And Masha quickly understands she cannot escape by running, fighting, or resisting openly, and instead she observes the bear carefully and waits for an opportunity. Because clever thinking is valued in folklore more than physical power, and this pause in the story is deliberate because listeners are meant to stay with Masha as she plans and thinks, and eventually she tells the bear that she wants to bake bread and send it to her grandparents, and she asks for permission to prepare food and place it in a basket, and the bear agrees, believing he remains in control, and unaware that Masha has formed a plan. And after baking the bread, she quietly climbs into the basket herself, arranging it so she cannot be seen. And then she warns the bear not to peek inside while he carries it to the village, and the bear lifts the basket and begins walking through the forest. And during the journey, each stop becomes a moment of tension because the bear grows curious, but each time he pauses, Masha calls out from inside the basket, reminding him not to look, and he obeys. And this repetition reinforces the lesson that intelligence must be active and alert. And when the bear finally reaches the village, barking dogs and approaching villagers frighten him, causing him to drop the basket and flee back into the forest, allowing Masha to climb out safely and reunite with her grandparents. And in traditional versions, the story ends immediately after her return because the lesson is complete and needs no explanation. And the purpose of the tale was not to frighten children, but to teach them caution, obedience, and the value of clever thinking. And across early recorded versions collected by folklorists in the 19th century, the structure remains consistent. Masha enters the forest, becomes lost, encounters the bear, is kept from leaving, and escapes through intelligence rather than strength. And this consistency shows how oral storytelling preserved meaning across generations. And the bear in this story is not a villain in the modern sense, but a representation of a force stronger than a child, something that cannot be overcome directly and must be navigated wisely. And the forest serves as a boundary between safety and danger, home and unknown, and childhood and experience. And listeners were meant to understand that crossing such boundaries carries consequences. And when Masha returns, she is unchanged in age, but changed in understanding, which is why storytellers ended the tale without further reflection. Because folklore trusted listeners to absorb meaning on their own, and over time, as stories were printed, adapted, and eventually transformed into entertainment, the bear became friendly, the danger became playful, and the warning softened. Yet beneath those changes, the original folktale remained intact because its lesson was practical, memorable, and rooted in real experience. And even today, when the story is retold, it still communicates that intelligence, patience, and awareness can overcome situations where strength alone fails, and this endurance explains why. Masha and the bear survived for centuries, not because it was dramatic or frightening, but because it reflected everyday truths and transformed them into a story simple enough for children, yet meaningful enough for adults, allowing the lesson to be carried forward quietly through repetition, memory, and voice rather than instruction. ensuring the story remained alive, unchanged, and understood across generations, cultures, and time. In documentary terms, the survival of Masha and the bear as a folktale can be explained by how effectively it condensed lived experience into a structure simple enough to remember and repeat, yet strong enough to remain intact over centuries. And this structure relied on repetition, clarity, and cause and effect rather than spectacle, because oral storytelling required accuracy to survive, and errors were corrected through retelling and communal memory, and this is why the story maintains the same sequence across regions. Masha enters the forest, Masha becomes lost, Masha encounters the bear, Masha is prevented from leaving, and Masha escapes through intelligence, and nothing in this sequence is accidental because each step reinforces the lesson villagers wanted children to remember. And when folklorists such as Alexander Afanasyev collected Russian folktales in the 19th century, they recorded multiple versions of this story with only minor variations in wording, while the core events remained unchanged, showing how firmly the narrative had settled into cultural memory. And in these versions, the bear is consistently portrayed as strong, territorial, and unquestioned in authority, while Masha is small, vulnerable, and dependent on her ability to think rather than fight. And this imbalance is central to the story, because folklore often taught children how to navigate situations where power was unequal, whether with nature adults or circumstances. And by placing a child against a bear, the story exaggerated this imbalance to make the lesson unmistakable, and the use of domestic chores inside the bear's house was also intentional because it mirrored familiar household roles, allowing listeners to relate to the situation even as the setting remained dangerous and unnatural, and the basket itself served as a symbolic object representing both confinement and escape, because it is a container meant to carry goods, yet becomes the means by which Masha carries herself to safety. And this dual purpose reinforced the idea that tools and situations can change meaning depending on how they are used, and the repeated warning not to look inside the basket functioned as a rhythmic device that made the story easier to memorize, while also emphasizing the importance of discipline, patience, and listening. And the arrival of the bear at the village marked the return to social order because barking dogs and villagers represented collective protection, contrasting with the isolation of the forest. And this contrast taught children that safety exists within community, while danger often begins in separation. And it is notable that the bear flees rather than being punished or defeated, because folklore rarely resolves conflict through destruction, instead allowing natural boundaries to restore balance. And this ending reinforced the idea that danger can retreat when confronted with awareness and unity rather than force. And because the story ends immediately after Masha's return, it avoids unnecessary explanation, trusting listeners to interpret meaning themselves, which was a hallmark of oral tradition. And this trust allowed the story to be told to different ages with different levels of understanding as children absorbed the basic lesson, while adults recognized deeper patterns of behavior, consequence, and responsibility. And over time, as literacy increased and storytelling moved from spoken word to print adaptations, began to smooth harsher edges, replacing caution with comfort and transforming the bear into a comic figure. Yet the original narrative remained recognizable because its structure was resilient and adaptable, and even modern retellings continue to follow the same sequence, demonstrating how effective the original design was. And this adaptability explains why the story crossed regional and generational boundaries, remaining relevant despite cultural change. And from a documentary perspective, Masha and the Bear serves as an example of how folklore functioned as education embedded within entertainment, allowing communities to pass practical wisdom without formal instruction. And the forest in this story was not simply a setting, but a boundary representing the unknown and the responsibilities that come with independence, while the bear embodied the idea that the world operates by its own rules, indifferent to innocence and expectation. And Masha's survival depended not on chance, but on observation, restraint, and planning qualities that villages valued deeply and taught indirectly through narrative. And because oral stories relied on repetition to survive, they avoided unnecessary complexity, ensuring that listeners could recall and retell them accurately. And this is why the story contains no subplots, no extraneous characters, and no moral speeches, because simplicity preserved accuracy and meaning, and this efficiency allowed the tale to remain stable even as details shifted across tellings. And today, when the story is examined historically, it reveals how communities used narrative to encode behavioral guidance, shaping how children understood risk decision-making and accountability. And this practical foundation explains why the story endured beyond its original context, continuing to be shared, adapted, and recognized long after forests became symbolic rather than immediate threats. And even stripped of cultural context, the story still communicates its lesson clearly, demonstrating the power of well-constructed folklore to transcend time, medium, and audience. And through this endurance, Masha and the Bear stands not as fantasy, but as evidence of how storytelling once served as a vital tool for teaching awareness, respect, and intelligence in a world where mistakes carried real consequences, and where survival often depended on the ability to think carefully, act patiently, and recognize limits before crossing them. And this quiet effectiveness is what allowed the story to survive unchanged in purpose even as its tone softened, ensuring that beneath every adaptation the original lesson remains present, waiting to be recognized by those who listen closely.